Spitfire is one of the greatest and most charismatic aircraft ever built. Even today, it never fails to captivate audiences, young and old, with its grace and beauty, perhaps inspiring new generations of youngsters to discover flight. Indeed, one wonders how a thing of such beauty could be an effective killing machine. And yet they were. Spitfires fought in all theatres of the Second World War, from Europe to the Pacific. It performed many roles, as well as that of the traditional fighter, including ground attack, bombing, and photo reconnaissance. In fact, the Spitfire was the only fighter to begin full production before 1939 and still be produced after 1945. Long after its contemporaries were retired, the Spitfire continued to be developed, resulting in 24 different versions. Today, only a few dozen are kept in flying condition, even though over 22,000 were built. The story of the Spitfire begins in the early 1930s. During the years following the end of the First World War, air racing became a popular spectator sport. The premier event was the Schneider Trophy. In 1929, the trophy was won by a team of British Royal Air Force pilots. Their aircraft was a small float plane built by Supermarine. Supermarine had carved out a reputation for building seaplanes that helped make international air travel a reality in the years between the wars. In 1930, Supermarine teamed up with engine builder Rolls-Royce to build another race-winning aircraft. Under the rules of the Schneider Trophy, any country winning 3 times in a row got to keep the trophy in perpetuity. In 1931, Supermarine and Rolls-Royce did it again, setting a new world speed record along the way. The aircraft was designed by Supermarine's chief designer, Reginald Mitchell, and the partnership with Rolls-Royce during the Schneider Trophy years was destined to result in the legendary Spitfire. The early 1930s were turbulent times in Europe. The Nazis, under Adolf Hitler, had seized power in Germany. They began rebuilding their armed forces, despite severe restrictions that had been imposed following the First World War. Under the terms of the 1919 armistice, Germany was forbidden to have an air force. Hitler, gambling on the fact that few European leaders had an appetite for confrontation, authorized the building of a new air force, equipped with the latest monoplane fighters and bombers. In British minds, the bomber was the ultimate terror weapon that rendered all defences redundant. This was due to the fact that British cities had been bombed by German Zeppelins and Gotha aircraft during the First World War. Recognizing that its fighter defences were obsolete, the Air Ministry began preparing specifications for a new monoplane fighter. At Supermarine, Mitchell had been using his experience in the design of high-speed aircraft to create a new fighter. The challenge was to house the required 8 guns in the thin wings, which were vital to the design's projected performance. A solution was found by building the elliptical wing, giving the Spitfire to be its legendary shape. Not only could the 8 guns be accommodated, 4 on each side, but it had an extraordinary aerodynamic performance. Power was to be provided by a new engine from Rolls-Royce. Designated the PV-12, it would later be known as the Merlin. But Mitchell's creation was beaten into the air by a competing design from Sidney Cam at Hawker. The Hurricane was a much more conventional design in that it incorporated fabric stretched over a frame, just like many of Hawker's elegant biplanes produced in the 1920s and 30s. But the Hurricane was easy to build, and as was found during the height of the Battle of Britain, it could take an enormous amount of punishment and would always get its pilot home, just so long as no bullets hit the control cables. Mitchell's design, still known as the Type 224, was a very complex aircraft, relying on a stressed metal skin, which, although very light and strong, was difficult to build, particularly under wartime conditions. In March 1936, Type 224 made its maiden flight, with test pilot Mutt Summers at the controls. On landing, he declared that it was perfect. Nothing should be touched. Then in May, the RAF ordered 310 aircraft without waiting for test reports. But where did the Spitfire get its name from? There are many theories. Because its maker, Supermarine, began with an S, it was decided that the new aircraft should follow suit. Many names were considered, including Shrike and Shrew. Fortunately, these were discarded, and from somewhere, its origins lost in time, came the name Spitfire. But just a year after the Spitfire's first flight, and with orders coming in, R.J. Mitchell died after a long fight with cancer. His assistant, Joseph Smith, took over, and it was he who would design all future marks. In August 1938, the first Mark I Spitfires were delivered to the RAF's No. 19 Squadron, based at Duxford, near Cambridge. In Europe, events were heading to war, as Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, sought assurances from Adolf Hitler as to his intentions. By August 1939, some 10 squadrons were now equipped with Spitfires, less than 200 aircraft, of which only 150 were actually ready for battle. The first batch of 77 Spitfire Mark I's had a two-bladed fixed-pitch propeller. Later deliveries had a three-bladed, two-positioned air screw, with fine pitch for takeoff and coarse pitch for cruising. The first aircraft also had a flat canopy, which taller pilots found very restrictive. This was replaced by a bulged version, which was to become a distinctive feature on future Marks. There were also improvements inside the aircraft. For example, the windscreen was changed to an armoured type, and the pilot also received 6mm armour panels behind his seat and on the rear bulkheads of the engine bay. Another early problem was that the guns tended to freeze at high altitude. The solution was to introduce heating to the 8.303 Browning machine guns. Also, waxed cloth covers were placed over the gun ports to keep them dry until the pilot fired his first burst. Many pilots found the new aircraft difficult to adapt to. For those used to the open cockpits of its predecessors, the Spitfire seemed claustrophobic. Retractable undercarriages were also a new feature in these aircraft, and it was not unknown for pilots to embarrass themselves by forgetting to lower the wheels before landing. Combined with the narrow track and somewhat fragile undercarriage, landing a Spitfire in a crosswind could be hazardous. Similarly, taking off required the pilot to change hands on the stick so that he could raise the undercarriage. The spectacle of a Spitfire porpoising as its inexperienced pilot struggled to raise the undercarriage whilst flying in a straight line became part of Spitfire folklore.
Flying a Spitfire for the first time, my first flight was on a Mark I, on which you had to pump up the undercarriage. So there was a little glamour taken out of when you first got airborne, because having to pump up the undercarriage, you tended to move the stick backwards and forwards, so you went off in a rather undulating manner. But once the undercarriage was up, then it was frightening, exhilarating.
Even taxiing took some getting used to. Although the nose of the aircraft was extremely elegant, the pilot could not see forward. The solution was to zigzag by swinging the tail from side to side. Yet, once pilots had mastered its idiosyncrasies, they came to love the Spitfire.
When you get into a car, you strap yourself in. Well, you're strapped into a car. When you climbed into a Spitfire, you strapped the Spitfire onto you, and you became part of the Spitfire, and the Spitfire became part of you.
But the Spitfire nearly failed to take off at all. The difficulties in building the aircraft meant that there were not nearly enough rolling off the production line. The Air Ministry considered cancelling production. In the end, Supermarine were able to persuade the men from the ministry that things would improve, especially when a new shadow factory was opened at Castle Bromwich in the Midlands. On September the 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Then on the 3rd, Britain declared war against Germany. On the 6th, Spitfires of 74 Squadron went into action for the first time. But the sortie ended in tragedy when they accidentally shot down 2 Hurricanes from number 56 Squadron. It was not until October the 16th that the first enemy aircraft fell to the Spitfire's guns. 2 Junkers Ju-88s and 2 Heinkel HE-111s were shot down by Spitfires from number 602 and 603 squadrons over the Firth of Forth. But this period was popularly known as the Phony War. Britain faced little in the way of a direct threat, and the Luftwaffe's raids were few and far between. Fighter Command used the time to hone its skills. The tragic shooting down of the Hurricanes led to a greater effort in combining all the different aspects of air defense into a more cohesive whole. It was essential that radar operators, observers, plotters and controllers had accurate and timely information if the system was to work. Little could they have known just how critical this would be as events moved towards the momentous summer of 1940 and what would later be called the Battle of Britain.
As regards the technical defense, like radar and IFF, without those, I don't think the Battle of Britain would have been won, because so many pilots and aircraft would have had to have flown continuous patrols. And I don't think the reserves of either would have supported that type of tactic. So the radar enabled us to be scrambled when actually the aircraft, the enemy were attacking. And the IFF we had enabled the plotters to identify us from the opposition.
In April 1940, the Phony War came to an abrupt end when Germany invaded Norway. The following month, it was the turn of the Low Countries and then France to experience the full wrath of the German blitzkrieg. Although Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, head of Fighter Command, authorized Spitfire squadrons to fly offensive patrols across the Channel, the majority were held back in preparation for the sterner battles to come. It was a far-sighted policy, but it brought the fighter pilots much criticism, especially as the troops waited to be evacuated off the beaches at Dunkirk. Despite this, 67 Spitfires were lost during the Battle of France, which Fighter Command could ill afford.
I don't think we could have done any more than we did. There's a book being read about it, and the main thing is that we were so few. When you remember how far we had to fly, because of our endurance, we didn't have long-range tanks. We could only have perhaps an hour, perhaps less, over there. And to try and keep that up in May, which is sunshine from 5:30 in the morning till, 10, 11 at night, how could we be there all the time?
But valuable lessons had been learned. It was realized that the Luftwaffe's tactical formation of a loose finger four was superior to the RAF's traditional Vic formation of 3 aircraft. Also, guns were harmonized to converge at 250 yards rather than 400. The fuel was changed for a higher octane, which increased the Spitfire speed by a useful 25 miles per hour at sea level and 34 miles per hour at 10,000 feet. With France lost, Britain was on her own. It would be down to the young pilots of Fighter Command to stem the Nazi tide. The Luftwaffe's commander, Hermann Goering, was convinced that he could defeat the RAF within weeks, paving the way for a full amphibious invasion. Officially, the Battle of Britain was fought between July the 10th and October the 31st, 1940. Fighter Command had 27 squadrons of Hurricanes and 19 of Spitfires. Pilots came from all over the world and backgrounds. As the battle unfolded, Fighter Command refined its tactics by ordering the Hurricanes to attack the bombers while the Spitfires went for their fighter escorts.
When I first went into battle, I was on a very steep learning curve. I was learning to fly the aircraft and endeavouring to learn how to shoot. And certainly on my earlier flights, someone would shout on the radio, break. That meant we were being attacked. And I broke a steep turn, left or right. And I found myself completely alone in the sky, not even an enemy aircraft in sight, let alone any of my rest of the squadron. As the war progressed, I'm talking about during the Battle of Britain now, one became more aware. And it was during this period of complete, almost ignorance of not knowing what was happening, to becoming aware, where, of course, you lost the most pilots. If you got over that steep learning curve, you stood a far better chance of survival.
The Spitfire's great adversary was the Messerschmitt Me-109. Both aircraft had very similar performance, with advantages and disadvantages in certain conditions. The Spitfire could turn more tightly and was slightly faster, below 15,000 feet. But the Messerschmitt had superior rate of climb and was marginally faster, above 20,000 feet. Also, the Messerschmitt's Daimler-Benz engine used fuel injection, which meant that it could push negative G at the top of a climb. The Spitfire's Merlin engine had a float-type carburetor, which meant that the pilot had to perform longer maneuvers in order to maintain positive G. Otherwise, the engine would cut out due to fuel starvation.
I've chased a few 109s. I don't know who was most frightened, he or I. But when they were heading for home, they went into a steep dive. With petrol injection, if you attempted, they have petrol injected engines. If with the Spitfire you attempted to follow them exactly the same way by pushing the stick forward, your engine cut out. And by that time, the Spitfire, the enemy was well away and out of range.
But the Messerschmitt's big disadvantage was a lack of endurance. By the time the bomber formations had formed up and made their way to the English coast, the escorting fighters were running low on fuel, leaving them just a few minutes of combat time before they had to break off and head back to France.
Well, then again, my own experience was that they just dove away. I don't remember having a dogfight that lasted very long, because eventually he'd get on his tail and then he'd dive away, you see. In fact, my experience of generally of 109s is that they always wanted to get away, funnily enough. They didn't want to engage. So you were either caught yourself and didn't have much option, or you had a few moments, or you caught him without being seen, or you got a shot or two and then away you went. And you'd be very lucky if you could, if you're already behind, be able to catch up. I had several occasions, full ball going down, and sometimes occasionally getting a little bit nearer, mostly not being able to.
Although the Luftwaffe had a numerical advantage, Fighter Command was flying and fighting over its home bases. This meant that more sorties could be launched as aircraft could be refueled, rearmed and sent back into the fray up to half a dozen times during the day. It was grueling for the pilots, who would be roused an hour before dawn and not stood down until the sun had set.
Tiredness was very much with you. And when, for instance, at Biggin Hill we had huts, we had some beds there, which you used to lie on. And when you first came on readiness, well, I can't remember what dawn readiness was at the time, say it was 5:30, and you sometimes lay on the bed until you were scrambled. But it's tiredness, oblique tension. Waiting for that telephone to ring was the most exhausting part of being a fighter pilot during the Battle of Britain.
The Luftwaffe's main targets were the radar stations and airfields in Kent and Sussex. Without these, Fighter Command would be blind and unable to launch aircraft quickly enough as well as repair them. But during July and August, Fighter Command was in danger of losing this battle of attrition. But in a stroke of fortuitous timing, Goering, presuming he had done enough, began diverting his bombers to attack London. It gave the hard-pressed Fighter Command just enough of a respite in which to regroup and repair its airfields. On September the 15th, the battle reached its climax. In a last-ditch attempt to crush the RAF, the Luftwaffe launched repeated attacks. Failure would dash any hopes of mounting an invasion. The eyes of the populace looked upwards to gaze in apprehension as aircraft wove intricate patterns in white vapor trails against the deep blue sky. Occasionally, one would fall to earth in flames.
10 seconds has been an awful long time to have a finger, it may have been only 15 seconds. When you think of it, holding it there, I mean, 3 seconds is a heck of a long time. And there were fired, a lot of bullets were coming out at a time. But then the enemy was a long way ahead, mostly, and if he was close, he could be out of the movement of the aircraft, be so quick you wouldn't be able to follow it, unless you didn't know you were there. So, generally speaking, we were advised to go short bursts and reassess between each burst, and I'm quite sure that was the best thing to do. Unless you were close and he wasn't noticing, and then you could afford to go on and you could see them going up, and that didn't happen very often. The chap would know pretty quickly that he was in real trouble.
But German losses were mounting more quickly, and by the end of September, the German High Command lost its nerve. The worst was over. But it had cost Fighter Command dearly in terms of lives and aircraft. Some 565 Hurricanes were lost, along with 352 Spitfires. At the height of the battle, the Spitfire Mark I's began to be replaced by a Mark II. The main difference between this and the Mark I was a new Merlin 12 engine with over 1,000 horsepower on tap. Today, this Mark II flies as part of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight and is the oldest flying Spitfire in the world. Like most of her sisters, this Mark II was built at the Castle Bromwich factory and joined the battle during August 1940. As with all the aircraft in the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, her colour schemes are changed periodically in honour of particular squadrons. For example, the XTD markings on her flanks commemorates an aircraft flown by squadron leader George Danone. As a member of No. 603 Squadron, he was credited with shooting down the first German aircraft over British soil. Later, during the Battle of Britain, he led the squadron from its home at Hornchurch in Essex, twice surviving being shot down. In another scheme, the BBMF Mark II flew in the markings of No. 277 Squadron, which was a search and rescue unit based at Hawkinge in Kent. BAY Old Lady was donated to the RAF by the Bank of England. The search and rescue role began in 1943. The Spitfires were equipped to drop a dinghy, food and medicine packs to ditched aircrew. As the Spitfire was able to defend itself, it could wait until a walrus amphibian arrived to pick the crew up and then escort them home. The defeat of the Luftwaffe in 1940 enabled the RAF to go on the offensive. A series of raids, known as rhubarbs, were launched in an attempt to lure the Luftwaffe into action. In order to provoke the enemy further, small numbers of bombers with heavy fighter escorts were sent over in raids known as circuses. But the pilots of fighter commands were in for a nasty shock, for the Germans had also developed the Me-109. The new F variant was far superior to the Hurricane and more maneuverable than the Spitfire at 25,000 feet. Although work was underway for an all-new Spitfire Mark III, this was still some way off from being ready. A stopgap aircraft was urgently needed. The result was the Mark V. The airframe had been strengthened and a new Merlin 45 or 46 engine installed, which produced over 1,200 horsepower. The Mark V also had a much-needed upgrade in its killing power, as it now had 20mm cannon. The .303 Browning bullet was relatively small, and on its own could do little damage. Concentrating the number of shells hitting the target using a high rate of fire from a number of guns compensated to a certain extent for the small size. But a cannon fired a much bigger shell and therefore could cause more damage for less effort. Although attempts had been made at installing cannon in the Mark I, the vibrations were too much for the slender wing. The problem was overcome in the Mark V by adding bulges in the wings so that the larger weapons could be accommodated. The Mark V proved to be the equal of the Messerschmitt, although by now most of the Luftwaffe's fighters had been moved to the east to help in Germany's offensive against Russia. Those that remained often chose not to engage the Spitfires. Even still, losses were mounting, and in November 1941, the sweeps were temporarily suspended.
We were just putting ourselves in danger, and for what? Because obviously, if somebody clobbered your glycol or crude oil over there, you'd have the same trouble as the Germans had when they were fighting the Battle of Britain. So if you were damaged in any way, it was not at all certain you could get back. Whereas you can bail out over UK and you're all right. and what were we achieving? I mean, there's peanuts as far as we could see, and we were just wasting lives, because we lost lives, all right. It did, I think it did, later on, I must say, I still had the feeling, when I was doing it anyway, that I'd got to get in there. But from reading what people have written afterwards, it soon became like a boxing match, if you like. If somebody was at you and you could nip out of the way, you would, and then you'd come back again. You'd never bother to go for anybody who were higher than you were, and you'd have plenty of time to try and get yourself in. It was a sort of, I don't want to use the word game, because of course it was life and death, but it was a game in the sense that it was concentrated, is it worth doing or isn't it worth doing? Whereas in the Battle of Britain, and I must say as far as I was concerned, because I wasn't there long enough for that sort of thing, it was only to be shot at, get at it, come what may. The danger to yourself was secondary.
There are a number of Mark V's still flying today, including this example, which flies with the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Originally, this particular Spitfire came off the production line at Castle Bromwich in August 1941 and was delivered to No. 222 Squadron, in whose markings she has flown for a number of years. From 1947, she was used for air racing, before a heavy landing ended her racing career. Following restoration by Vickers, she was presented back to the RAF in 1965, where she has remained ever since. But for the 2003 display season, this Mark V was given a Desert Air Force scheme. During the first years of the war, priority had been to keep all Spitfires back for home defence, even though British forces were fighting a tough campaign across the deserts of North Africa. By 1942, the pressure had eased and production was at a sufficient level for Spitfires to be sent to other theatres. The first Spitfires arrived in the Western Desert in April 1942, equipping No. 145 Squadron. They were Mark 5Bs with 4-bladed props and 2.5-inch machine guns, replacing the normal armament. The Merlin was also suitably tweaked to give more horsepower at high altitude. This example is in the markings of a Spitfire, which flew with the 224th Wing as part of the Desert Air Force during the Tunisian campaign of 1943. Although the Spitfire is remembered for its combat role in the skies over Europe, it also played an important part in protecting the fleet at sea. Even before the war, Supermarine had approached the Admiralty with a navalised version of the fighter. But in 1940, Winston Churchill ordered that all production be channeled towards home defence. The Navy would have to wait. But the Spitfire could never be the ideal aircraft for carrier operations. The long nose meant that visibility was limited, making it particularly difficult for manoeuvring around on the relatively small British carriers. The undercarriage was also too fragile and narrow to withstand the heavy landings that Navy pilots sometimes had to carry out. But once in the air, the Spitfire was every bit as effective as its land-based cousins, and for all its disadvantages, the final mark of the Seafire was one of the most formidable piston-engined aircraft ever to fly. The first Seafires were based on the Mark V, but with strengthening for the catapult, a lengthened undercarriage which was raked to reduce the risk of tipping over, and a strengthened wing to allow external stores to be carried. The Seafire Mark III was also based on the Mark V, but was the first to feature folding wings. It was also the most numerous Seafire produced. By the end of 1941, the Spitfire was again in danger of finding itself outclassed. This time the threat came from the Focke-Wulf FW-190. It not only had a powerful BMW engine, it also had a high rate of roll. In April 1942, 59 Spitfires were shot down. The following month, the Messerschmitt Me-109G entered service. This version was optimized for high-level operations. It seemed as if the Spitfire had nowhere to go. In an attempt to improve the Spitfire's high-altitude capability, a Mark V was given longer wingtips. Designated the Mark VI, it featured a partially pressurized cabin. The canopy was fixed in place on the ground, and once airborne, could only be jettisoned in an emergency. But the Mark was not a success, and only 100 were built. Then, by great good fortune, an FW-190 landed at Pembrey by mistake. It gave the RAF an early opportunity to test the aircraft against the Spitfire Mark V. It proved better in almost all respects, except for its turning ability. In order to improve the Mark V's rate of roll, 4 feet 4 inches was cut from the Spitfire's wingtips. This clipped-wing Spitfire was marginally faster than the standard Mark V, but had a considerably better rate of roll. The addition of a modified supercharger helped give the clipped and cropped Spitfire a speed at low level equivalent to that of the FW-190. Although the Mark V began life as an interim aircraft, it was so successful that more Mark Vs were built than any other Spitfire. The next major Spitfire Mark was intended to be the Mark VIII. This Mark introduced the 4-bladed propeller and the Merlin 60 series of engines, which were to be the last of that legendary line. The Merlin 61 fitted to the Mark VIII produced over 1,500 horsepower and was fitted with a modified carburetor that allowed negative G maneuvering. Mark VIIIs were sent out to the Far East, so that by March 1944 there were 7 squadrons equipped with Spitfire Mark VIIIs. But it was the Mark IX that was to restore the Spitfire's edge over its German rivals. The Mark IX was to be the last of the Merlin-powered Spitfires, and to many it is the finest of all, although like the Mark V, it was intended as a stopgap version until the Mark VIII was ready.
We got the 9s with this booster on, supercharger, extra super. I mean, all of them had superchargers. There's an extra booster, but you could only bring it in at altitude. That was wonderful because you could see a 109, say, a mile away, and you knew if he didn't see you, you could catch him up. That was really satisfying. It's a wonderful feeling. I'm gaining. Of course, when you get to that stage, now the learning curve, you've completed it, and you're feeling confident, you're aware of what's going on. That's when the trouble starts. That's when you start getting hit again.
The first squadron to receive the Mark IX was number 64 at Hornchurch in July 1942. The Mark IX compared favourably when tested against the captured FW-190, which was just as well, for the Luftwaffe, responding to Fighter Command's offensive, had begun mounting low-level hit-and-run raids of their own with small numbers of FW-190s. During the early part of 1943, the tide began to turn as more of the squadrons equipped with Mark Vs received the new Mark IX. fighter sweeps were mounted across the Channel, using Bostons escorted by Spitfires. But increasingly, the Luftwaffe declined to fight, as resources and men were being drained by the Russian campaign and the Allied bomber offensive. During the summer of 1943, the US Army Air Force arrived in Britain and began mounting its daylight bombing offensive. During those early operations, Spitfire squadrons provided fighter escort, but it was found that they simply did not have the range. The problem was not resolved until the arrival in service of the North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang's performance was dramatically improved with the introduction of the Merlin 61 engine built under license by Packard. Packard-built Merlins were also installed in the Mark IX. These Spitfires were redesignated as Mark 16s. Later Mark 16s were given a cut-down rear fuselage and a teardrop canopy to give the pilot better visibility. The Mark IX was the main Spitfire to see action in Europe in the last years of the war. The Mark IX played a critical role in establishing the Allies' air superiority over Europe prior to the arrival in service of the American-built Mustangs, Thunderbolts and Lightnings. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the RAF's order of battle included over 55 squadrons of Spitfires. Following the landings, the Spitfire Mark IXs of No. 222 Squadron were the first Allied fighters to operate from Normandy, having arrived on June the 10th. On July the 17th, Spitfire Mark IXs strafed a German staff car. Inside was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who, as commander of the German defences, was responsible for repelling the Allied invasion. The car turned over into a ditch, fracturing the Field Marshal's skull, injuries from which he never fully recovered. In early 1943, the Merlin Spitfires were joined by an all-new Griffon-powered example. Like the Merlin, it was a V12 supercharged engine, but could produce over 1,700 horsepower. The Griffon made the Spitfire 3 foot longer, and the nose had to have two large bulges above the exhaust ports to accommodate the cylinder blocks of the new engine. The Mark 12 gave the RAF something that could catch the FW-190 at low level, being capable of 350 miles per hour at sea level. During the early part of 1944, the Mark 14 entered service. The photo reconnaissance version of this new aircraft was the Mark 19, two of which fly with the Battle of Britain Memorial flight today. In classic Spitfire tradition, the new engine was mated to an available airframe, in this case a Mark 8. In order to absorb the greater power, a 5-bladed prop was introduced. Some of the Mark 14s had the rear fuselage cut down and a teardrop canopy added to improve visibility. The Mark 19 was the photo reconnaissance version of the Mark 14. It was unarmed and had, at just over 1,500 miles, the greatest range of all Spitfire Marks. A Mark 19 also flew the very last RAF Spitfire sortie in 1954.
The 14 was an extraordinary airplane. It was really so powerful. It made such a noise, even in the cockpit. It was like flying a motorbike. That was my feeling about it. You were certainly one with the aeroplane, and when you pushed the foot, really, you were moved. It was great. But it had this even worse problems with the effect on the controls.
The Mark 18, like the 14, used a Mark 8 airframe fitted with a two-stage Griffon engine producing over 2,300 horsepower. It could also carry extra fuel in the wings. The 20 series Spitfires, although superficially similar, were in fact a major rebuild of the design. The wingtips were flattened and the whole aircraft was significantly heavier than the earlier types, thus requiring a stronger undercarriage. Although the Griffon 61 or 64 driving a 5-bladed prop was the normal power plant, some were also fitted with the Griffon 85, which drove two contra-rotating 3-bladed props. The Mark 21 and 22 were nearly 100 miles an hour faster than the original Mark 1. Such was the pace of development. The last Mark was the 24, which was the same as the 21 and 22, but armed with a short-barreled Hispano cannon. These later Marks only arrived in service at the very end of the war, and then only in limited numbers.
In respect to the development of the Spitfire, as I think I've already said, I think Mitchell's Spitfire disappeared after the Mark 9. I flew the 14, the 16, the 19, the 22. I mean, and those later Spitfires were not really Spitfires.
But the world was moving into the jet age. The Spitfire's days were numbered. But development of the Spitfire and Seafire continued to the point where they warranted new names, the Spiteful and Seafang. Few of either made it into the air, although the straight laminar flow wings did find their way onto a Supermarine's first jet fighter, the Attacker. Spitfire served in every theatre of World War II and with every Allied Air Force at some time or another. As well as air combat, they performed ground attack, carried bombs under their wings, and even shot down V-1 flying bombs. At the end of the war, a few Mark 9s were converted into two-seat trainers. Actual production ceased on the 20th of February 1948, by which time some 20,351 Spitfires and 2,408 Seafires had been built. The last RAF Spitfire did not retire until June 1957. Despite the number built, only a handful remain flying today, although more are being returned to flight. We end this program with a fine display by 3 Spitfires over Biggin Hill. The aircraft are a Mark 9, 16 and 18. They are joined by a Corsair, from which we filmed the spectacular display of precision formation flying. The sound of the Merlin and the even rarer Griffon is an evocative song as it powers the beautiful lines of these most elegant of aircraft through the sky, transporting us back to the summer of 1940 when everything hung in the balance. Even in the 21st century, its name remains a powerful reminder of arguably Britain's finest hour, the Spitfire.